Excellent. All right. Welcome. Welcome everyone today to our driving rehab class. We have two teachers here today with us, two people presenting. We're so fortunate to have them. So I think Charles is going to go first. He goes by Chuck Bombardier. He has a PhD and is a clinical psychologist and professor at the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at University of Washington. He's worked in rehab, inpatient rehab at Harborview Medical for many years and has co-authored a number of papers on driving following a TBI. So comes with a lot of rich background, both professionally and academically to this topic. We're very thankful to have you here today, Chuck. And after Chuck, we will have Jennifer Fox. She's a PT and she's a certified driving rehab specialist. She's worked with people doing therapy in the Seattle area for 32 years and has a variety of different locations and settings that she's done rehab in. She's a graduate from UW also. We're doing lots of good, proud yay, UW, which is awesome. We have lots of local, wonderful education here. She is also the owner of Driving Rehab Services. They provide evaluations and education for folks that are interested in exploring whether going back to driving is the right fit for them. So without further ado, I will turn my microphone off and turn it over to you, Chuck.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you to Brain Northwest for sponsoring this educational forum. So as was described, we're going to talk about driving after brain injury, and we've already kind of gone over who we are. I'm going to just say that I'm just kind of providing a bit of research context and so forth. Jennifer is the real expert here among the two of us in driving. And so I'll have kind of a short presentation and then turn things over to her to kind of get into more practical and useful information. So, but yeah, I want to talk about return to driving after brain injury. And the topic of the research I'm going to talk about are kind of tries to answer a few different questions: who, what, when, where, and how safe. And I acknowledge the Traumatic Brain Injury Model Systems program. We are one of the model systems funded by the National Institute of Disability and Rehabilitation Research at the University of Washington. It's funded by the federal government. You should know that there's a good chance that our funding will be zeroed out. So if people are interested in having our research continue, please contact your legislators. And I want to also mention the lead investigator was Tom Novak from the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And then there's many participating sites of which we were one. So, whoops, sorry, I'll try to keep going. So first of all, the first question is who returns to driving? Well, most people turn out to return to driving. About 78% of people who drove before their brain injury do return to driving after their brain injury. People who return to driving, it's not everyone. It's kind of there are some people who are more or less likely to return to driving. First of all, people with less severe brain injury are more likely to return to driving. People who have more physical and motor functioning, better physical and motor functioning, return to driving. There's other factors like if you're more wealthy, you have higher family income. If you live in a rural area, you're more likely to return to driving. If you have a higher education, you return to driving more. And then if you have a reason to return to driving, like having paid employment, you're more likely to do that. Also, there's some cognitive predictors. So people who have better memory and better executive functioning, and executive functioning really refers to, the ability to problem solve and think flexibly. Those are predictors of return to driving. And then one big predictor of not returning to driving is people who have seizures. And I think most people are probably aware of the fact that when people have seizure disorders, that unless those seizures are well controlled for a certain period, people aren't really usually recommended to drive. And so I think those vary by state, and others can maybe mention more specifics about that. Well, what are some of the benefits or effects associated with return to driving? people are more likely to be able to participate in the community. I mean, driving gives us the ability to get around and do things, so it's really important to participation. Also, people have better functional outcomes when they return to driving. They have fewer symptoms of depression. Their life satisfaction is higher. Now, the thing about this research is it's cross-sectional research. It means it's kind of a survey. Some of these studies were survey research. Some of them were longitudinal, but this particular one was cross-sectional. So we really don't know what came first. Is it that people who are, you know, have better functional outcomes, um, they're more likely to return to driving, and that's the causal direction? Or is it that driving somehow leads to better functional outcomes? We don't really know. Same with the other relationships there. Well, when do people return to driving? So, as I mentioned before, about 78% of people return to driving, and the research covered 1 to 30 years after brain injury. So, covered a wide age, or a wide range of years post-injury. It's important to note that a number of people stop driving at some point. We think based on a number of factors, including the fact that they may decide that they're not safe driving or that they are uncomfortable driving. So about 14% do stop driving at some point of those who return to driving. Of those who return to driving, many of them return to driving fairly quickly. So 43% of people who return to driving, of those who return to driving, 43% return to driving within 6 months, so pretty quickly. And then if you look out to 24 months, by that time, most of the people who are going to return to driving have returned to driving, 92%. Where do people return to driving? So, not people don't just drive, maybe as much or in all the areas they used to drive. So what we know is that people tend to return to driving on local streets, not as much on highways. People tend to go on shorter neighborhood routes, around their homes, more than other longer routes. People tend to drive in more light traffic, more during the daytime. They tend to stick to, driving when there's good weather, and they tend to go at lower speeds. The next question is really, how safe are people who return to driving after brain injury? Well, we know that the rates of car crashes after brain injury are 1.5 to 2.5 times higher than the general population. So that is a concern. However, um, it looks like those elevated risk of crash were true of people before their brain injury. So as you can see in this bar graph, during the year before injury, people's crash rates per year were almost 15%. And then during the first year after brain injury, it's almost 10%. And the second year after injury is 6%. So these numbers are considerably higher than the general population. But as you can see, people weren't great drivers before uh, their brain injury. And maybe that is associated with, having a brain injury. Although in these studies, the crash that may have occurred causing brain injury was subtracted from the rates. On the other hand, while people are at higher risk of having brain injuries, or excuse me, of crashes, um, these findings don't really justify restricting people with brain injury from driving. It's just more a cautionary, and this is where Jennifer can maybe come in and talk about how do people, be more safe drivers. Definitely more research is needed to predict who's going to be at higher risk of crashing and how to prevent these high rates of automobile crashes before and after brain injury. So again, on this topic of how safe are people after brain injury, the good news is that most people, or many people with brain injury, do make some efforts to reduce their risk of car crashes. And they do this largely by limiting their driving in challenging situations. They reduce their driving in challenging situations. So again, it kind of repeats what I said earlier, but they tend to avoid, wisely tend to avoid heavy traffic. They tend to avoid driving at night, tend to avoid driving on highways, avoid long distance driving and driving in bad weather, and avoid driving at high speed. So people, I think people with brain injury often just make reasonable choices about how to reduce their risk. And these are some of the common choices they make to reduce their risk of, crashing after brain injury. So On the last thing on how safe are people after brain injury, how safe are they driving after brain injury, it has to do with confidence. And confidence is something that can kind of cut both ways. I mean, it's good to be confident and to, drive with confidence and not be too anxious. On the other hand, confidence can be exaggerated too high. Confidence can be higher than competence, and that's true in many situations for lots of different people. So what we know about people who drive after brain injury is that confidence tends to be very high. And confidence in ability to drive was the highest among young single men. So that group really thinks they are just perfectly okay driving. But the other thing about all this is that having lower confidence, and when people acknowledge that brain injury may have effects on their driving related abilities, that was associated with them making safer choices, such as restricting driving to those kind of less challenging situations. So the kind of take home point here is that people with very high driving confidence, maybe their confidence is too high, those people may benefit especially from assessment of their driving skills, monitoring, and especially during the early stages of recovering from brain injury when a lot of people are returning to driving. I should mention there's one slide that I didn't add, but I will just mention right now, and that is that in our research, when we looked at what influenced people's driving, there's two big influences. One is that professionals um, uh, were a big influence on people's driving. So, getting feedback from professionals about a person's driving abilities and so forth does have a positive effect. And also, feedback from family members and loved ones also has an effect. And people with brain injury are have been shown to listen to both types of feedback when trying to judge when they'll return to driving or whether they'll return to driving, whether they'll keep driving versus stop driving. So it's important to kind of think about, what are our opportunities to give people feedback to hopefully influence people to engage in safe driving after brain injury. So that's mine. I will stop sharing now and let Jennifer take over.
That was lovely. Go ahead and share your screen, Jennifer. And I've got some lovely questions that I've collected, and I just want people to know that I'm watching the chat and I'm holding those questions till the end.
Okay. How does that look?
Not seeing it yet. Did you stop sharing, Chuck, by chance? Just
I
want to
think
make.
I stopped sharing.
Yep,
Yes.
I see you. Okay. So try again, Jennifer, to click that share button. Take your time. This is the first time we've had two people on it teaching a class with separate slides. Okay, yep. So we don't see presenter view, but we see your slides. Great. Perfect. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to mute myself. There you go. Well done. Yay.
Okay. Do you know if there's a way to like move the bar? Oh, there it goes. Okay. Okay, thanks, Chuck. That was awesome. I loved all that information. And thank you to Brain Northwest for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about my profession and returning to driving after brain injury. So I thought I would start by telling a dad joke. Who doesn't love a dad joke? So I'm going to direct this to Reggie. What is a car's favorite meal?
Oh gosh. Breakfast?
Oh, break fast.
Break
Excellent.
fast.
Good job.
That's like the first dad joke I've ever gotten to. Thank you for this opportunity. It wasn't planned. I'm really excited. Thank you for that.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the CDRS credential, and then we'll discuss the comprehensive driving evaluation and when it is appropriate time for someone with a brain injury to have that evaluation. And then also a little bit about driving rehabilitation. So the Certified Driving Rehabilitation Specialist, or CDRS, is an experienced health professional, often an occupational therapist, physical therapist, or speech therapist, that has completed a formal certification program. This program includes both continuing education coursework as well as in-person clinical experience in the field of driving rehabilitation. So somebody with the CDRS credential should be knowledgeable in the full spectrum of driving rehabilitation services. It doesn't necessarily mean that every CDRS will perform all of those services, but anyone with a CDRS credential should be familiar with the different services available and be able to refer out as needed. So the Association of Driving Rehabilitation Specialists is the national organization that provides the CDRS credential, and the website for that is listed here. All right, I thought I would start with the comprehensive driving evaluation, since this is really where all driving rehab services start. So the comprehensive driving evaluation has two components. It has an off-road or clinical evaluation, as well as an on-road or behind the wheel evaluation. There are several institutions in the greater Seattle area that offer a clinical evaluation by itself. And this certainly does provide valuable information, and it often is a good place for someone to start if they know that returning to driving is one of their goals. But the comprehensive driving evaluation is the gold standard because it has both components together, both the off-road and the on-road component. So let's start by talking about the clinical evaluation. This is done in the clinic or office setting. It is going to start with obtaining the individual's medical and driving history. Certainly, if there are specific assessments that have been done, like a neuropsychological exam, that would be important information to review as well. But the clinical evaluation has three different components. It has a vision screen, a cognitive screen, and a physical screen. The vision screen is looking at different aspects of vision that are important for driving. So when someone sees an ophthalmologist, they're typically getting their visual acuity skills assessed for a corrective lens prescription. And this is important, but the CDRS vision screen is looking at other areas of vision that are just as important for driving. So some examples of this would be peripheral vision, if the individual has any field cuts, how the individual's eyes are working together, if this is affecting their depth perception. So different aspects of vision are important to be assessed. And the cognitive screen is going to look at the individual's mental abilities and how that is affected with driving tasks. So different aspects of the cognitive screen for somebody with a brain injury are going to be looking at their visual processing speed, assessing their attention, their divided attention. looking at an individual's visual perception skills. Does the individual have intact problem-solving abilities and good judgment? What the individual's cognitive flexibility is like. So those are examples of what is assessed during the cognitive screen. And then the physical screen is looking at an individual's functional mobility. If there are any focal deficits, like some strength or range of motion issues that could be affected, if there's any spasticity issues that may impact an individual's driving abilities. And then from the physical screen, it gives the CDRS information if adaptive equipment may be helpful or necessary for the individual. All right, so the second part of the comprehensive driving evaluation is the on-road or behind the wheel evaluation. And this is not only looking at an individual's driving skills in a variety of environments, but just as importantly, looking at their driving capacity. Road tests that are performed at driving schools and even at the Department of Licensing will typically just assess an individual's driving skills. But I think most people that have been through rehabilitation therapy to some extent understand that there are a lot of complex factors involved in the individual's safety. And this is really no different for driving. So the CDRS on-road evaluation is looking at a lot of those things. Certainly, we're looking at vehicle control, whether the individual has any issues with lane position, if they're accelerating and decelerating smoothly, but also looking at their hazard perception skills. Is the individual able to notice hazards in the environment and react appropriately to them? Does the individual have good problem-solving skills to be able to figure out a different way to do something if there is a sudden change in the environment? What are the individual's pathfinding skills? Are they able to get back home from an unfamiliar location? And then if it's determined in the clinical assessment that adaptive equipment might be helpful for the individual, the on-road assessment is where this is trialed. And then if it's determined that it will be helpful for the individual, a prescription is written for them to get this equipment installed in their vehicle. And then I'll just say that after I do the comprehensive driving evaluation, I review the results and my recommendations with the individual and family members if they're available. But I also follow that up with a comprehensive report that basically has all the objective information from the evaluation, share that with the individual, family, and medical provider. Okay, so I also wanted to just touch on some adaptive equipment examples. So CDRSs prescribe quite a wide range of adaptive equipment, everything from low-tech mechanical equipment to very complex high-tech electronic equipment. And for individuals with traumatic brain injuries specifically, in my experience, they don't need a lot of adaptive equipment. And if they do, it's usually going to be on the low-tech side. And so I just wanted to show a few examples of what might be recommended. On the left, we have a steering device. This is just a standard spinner knob that may be indicated if someone has an upper extremity weakness or imbalance. And on the right, we have an example of a panoramic camera setup. And a lot of vehicles these days are coming with different camera options, which are great. But there's also a lot of aftermarket cameras available these days that can be installed in older vehicles. And so having specific cameras can be helpful for an individual depending upon their areas of deficiency. I also wanted to mention ADAS. That is an acronym for, see if I can get it right, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. So that is what is being installed in most vehicles that are sold these days. Examples are lane positioning alert, blind spot detection, adaptive cruise control. So these are not necessarily adaptive equipment that I would prescribe, but having them, there certainly is a place for them, and research has shown that they do decrease accident risk and improve road safety. So having a vehicle that has ADAS is definitely an advantage. Okay, let's switch screens here. Okay, so how do you know when you're ready? If you're somebody that's had a brain injury, how do you know you're ready for a comprehensive driving evaluation if driving is one of your goals? So the candidate that is looking to see if they're ready would be medically stable. What this means is that their medical condition isn't changing significantly. There are no pending surgeries. There hasn't been any recent medication changes. So those types of things. The individual that's looking at returning to driving ideally should have completed all of their outpatient rehab therapies. In some situations, it may be appropriate for an individual to have a comprehensive driving evaluation if they're still participating in some outpatient therapy. But this really is a case-by-case basis. And certainly if the individual is still involved in some therapy, it would be important for the individual to communicate with their therapist that this is what they're considering, get the feedback if the therapist feels that it's appropriate and a good time for it. So opening that dialogue is important. And just as important as communication with the therapist is letting your medical provider know that this is something that you're considering, getting their feedback, how they feel about it, if they think it's a good idea. In Washington State, the Department of Licensing communicates with the physician or the medical provider directly to determine an individual's fitness to drive if there's a medical concern. So it is really important to communicate with your medical provider about your driving plans. Having an active driver's license or a learning permit is necessary to complete the on-road portion of the driving evaluation. Family and friend support. I think we all know that this is critical for all types of rehabilitation, and driving is really no different. The individual would need support to bring them to and from the evaluation, but also identifying somebody that can provide potential driving supervision in the future if driving rehabilitation is recommended, or if there are certain restrictions that are recommended after the evaluation. Having that person identified that can help with that is important. Knowing what vehicle an individual plans to use, if they own that vehicle, if they're going to borrow that vehicle, if they need to purchase that vehicle, if they have the financial means to pay for maintenance and fuel for the vehicle. So thinking about that would be important. And then independent ADLs. ADL, I think hopefully most people know, is activities of daily living. That's something that is addressed in rehab. And driving is really a higher level ADL. So if somebody's considering returning to driving, they should be independent with their basic level ADLs. And working on advanced level ADLs is a great pre-driver readiness skill. So either working on those advanced level skills or being independent with them will improve an individual's chance of driving success. And then independent community mobility. This is another great pre-driver readiness skill. The individual should be able to navigate their community independently, cross streets safely, potentially take public transportation independently, be able to plan a route, and even use a GPS. So other things that are important for an individual that's considering returning to driving and having that comprehensive driving evaluation are being able to manage their emotions. People that have had traumatic brain injuries often have difficulty with this. And so having some experience knowing how to manage their emotions is important. Having awareness into their challenging areas or their deficiencies is important. And I think, Chuck touched on this in his talk about, if somebody has overconfidence and maybe not great insight into their deficits, their accident risk is going to increase. So being aware of what their challenges are and being open to feedback in those areas is extremely important for learning. And also just to have control of before operating a large, heavy vehicle. Passenger activities. I like to say that people that are considering driving should be active passengers. There are several different ways an individual can do this. One example is called commentary driving, and this is where the potential driver, so the passenger, would be sitting in the front driving seat, not the driver's seat, the front passenger seat, and verbally explaining what they would be doing if they were driving. So it might sound something like this. I see the light is red up ahead, so I'm going to be slowing down and stopping behind the truck in front of me. There's somebody that's waiting to cross the street. Now they're starting to cross the street. The lights turned green. The pedestrian has crossed the street, so I'm going to proceed forward through the intersection. I want to take a right at the next street, so I'm looking in my blind spot and changing lanes to the right, those types of things. Other passenger activities would be identifying different signs on the road, noting when the speed limit changes, different regulatory signs, verbally talking about different hazards in the environment. So talking about pedestrians, mentioning if they're seeing a car that's planning to back up, those types of things. And then I like that Chuck talked a lot about restrictions with driving. I think it's important for people to know that returning to driving is often a process, and that initially that restrictions may be recommended, like he said, driving during the day or driving in familiar areas only at speeds under a certain number. But just know the individual should know that, or be open to certain restrictions, or to returning to driving, starting with some types of restrictions, and that with progress, they may be lifted, but they may not. So it really is individual, an individual thing. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that the individual should be motivated, and that this really should be the individual's goal. We talked about how important family and friend support is, but it is just as important that this really is the individual's goal. All right, so driving rehabilitation, what exactly is this? I think a good way to think about it is therapy for driving. So driving would be the individual's goal, and the comprehensive driving evaluation will determine if somebody has the potential to return to driving. It will also identify the areas of deficiency that are necessary to improve before the individual can return to driving. So driving rehabilitation may be necessary to help the individual work on those areas of deficiency so that they can return to independent driving. All right, so I wanted to just highlight some of the things I talked about that I hope you guys will take away and remember. I think it's important to remember that driving is a privilege. Unfortunately, a lot of people think of driving as their right, but it really is a privilege. Not only is it a privilege, it is expensive, and it really is getting more expensive. So the vehicle itself is expensive, the maintenance on a vehicle, the fuel, those are things that should be considered if somebody's thinking about returning to driving. Are those things realistic for the individual? Ideally, the individual should continue with all the recommended rehab therapies. This is going to increase their chance of success for driving. I wanted to mention vision therapy as well. Ideally, somebody with a traumatic brain injury that wants to return to driving should have a neuro-ophthalmologist evaluation. There are often vision issues for someone with a brain injury that impact their driving. So I think this is always a good idea. And then also to follow through with their recommendations, which may be vision therapy. Performing pre-driving readiness skills, becoming an active passenger, that will also increase your chance for success. Thinking about driving as another therapy. So knowing that it will take time and dedication and really a team of people in your corner. And then lastly, understanding that returning to driving is usually not all or nothing, that is often a progressive endeavor. Like I said before, there likely will be restrictions initially, or maybe always. And just understanding that and being open to that is important. All right, that's all I have. So I'm happy to answer any questions and clarify any information.
This is excellent. We're going to keep this up. This is Jennifer's closing slide. So while we ask questions, I'm just going to pause the recording and then we'll proceed. I have a number in the chat, as well as people probably have some live questions also.